All right, hey everybody, we're back. And we've just thought a lot about this idea of issues and their relationship to broader value systems. And specifically, I wanted to call your attention in that previous video to a couple of really important value sort of umbrellas that help to structure, in many cases, people's issue positions. That, of course, first of all, being this liberal-conservative divide that we have in the US, and then second, the post-material divide that scholars like Ronald Inglehart have theorized over the years. In this video, I want to turn to the question of issues more specifically. And in doing so, hopefully we can learn a little bit more about this idea of issue ownership. If you recall, in the last video, I just started off talking about this idea of issue ownership, which is the notion that a party can develop a reputation, or a candidate, that they are in some ways more competent in handling an issue of importance to voters than others. And so, I draw your attention to this Petrosic piece, which is a really important paper from 1996 in the American Journal of Political Science called Issue Ownership in Presidential Elections. And in this paper, Petrosic sort of makes the case that when issues become important in a campaign, when they become more salient or talked about more often, and those issues are owned, essentially, or a party's developed a reputation for being good on those issues, for being able to succeed at providing whatever it is that people want on those issues, lo and behold, parties tend to win more. And so in this graph, I want to just show you this graphic. I think it's a very useful one for these purposes. This is from that paper. What Petrosic essentially is showing here is we've got this party issue score that he's constructed, where we've got essentially cases in which the campaign is contested on the basis of what people are talking about throughout the campaign on Democratic-owned issues, or issues that at the time of these surveys, at the time of these elections, the majorities of Americans thought that Democrats would be better at handling those issues. In these cases, we had a party issue score that advantaged the Republicans. And so these were cases in which we saw that Republicans generally were campaigning, or the campaign itself was based on issues that Republicans had a reputation for handling better. And so here in the y-axis, we've got the Democratic percent. So essentially, this is the percent of the popular vote in that election that went to the Democratic Party relative to the rest of the candidates, including, of course, the Republican candidate. We know that in many of these cases, we also had some third-party candidates on the ballot. But so the Democratic percent is a good way to look at this, not the vote share or whatever, net of Democrats, Republicans, just because we had third-party candidates on the ballot occasionally. But so what we can see here is, like, if we take the '92 election, we can see that essentially, this is an election that obviously goes to the Democrats here with Clinton, with about 54% of the popular vote, which is a pretty big margin, honestly, if we think about historical comparisons. I mean, 64 is maybe a notable positive outlier here for the Dems as well. But you can see that in these cases, essentially, at that time, Democrats owned the issues that they were talking about during the campaign. So at the debates, in advertising, in all of the sort of public-facing stuff of a campaign, everything that people were talking about seemed to be issues that, at that moment, everybody said, "Oh, okay, the Democrats are good at that stuff." So that was essentially playing to the strength of that party. And again, this is not just valence issues, right? This is stuff that matters essentially in terms of the most important problems facing Americans. That can go far beyond just simply like economy, good or bad. We're talking about things like education. We're talking about things like foreign affairs, right? All kinds of issue positions. So read the paper again if you want to look at the methodology and learn a little bit about some of those kinds of issues. In '88, right? In '84. Okay, so this is the other side of the spectrum here. We're talking about obviously a sort of Reagan advantage here in a lot of cases where. Reagan was perceived as owning or being good at some of the issues that were valued as being very important to the candidates as well. We've got some high residual sort of cases here, it's like '72, where the party issue score was actually slightly pro-democratic, and yet the Democrats only received 40% of the vote. So regardless, I think this is a really interesting sort of depiction of the way in which issue ownership, or caring about the issues upon which the Democrats or Republicans are going to have an advantage, is essentially going to determine in many respects the outcome of elections. So issues matter, I think, is what Petrosik is saying. Beyond just valence politics, beyond just, how are you relative to 4 years ago, this is actually staking out a claim that issues do actually matter in the composite to determine who wins the election. And so I think one, background issue, if we're thinking about this, if we are going to take issues seriously, is where do candidates get their reputations? Where does this reputation come from, right? How was it that, Reagan gets this reputation for being good on these issues that are of importance to voters in the 80s? How is it that Clinton gets, this is subsequent elections, right? How come the Democrats start to gain in their reputations, right, about this stuff, right? How does this work? Where do candidates get their reputations on the issues? And so I think one thing we might think about is that parties' reputations come from the actions in office and campaign communication, right? So incumbents obviously play a really important role in determining what voters perceive as being issue ownership. I think also about the fact that different candidates, right? George H.W. Bush is going to be perceived a lot differently than Reagan. Clinton is going to be perceived a lot differently from somebody like Gore, even, right? So these kinds of candidate-based differences, I think, are also going to matter a lot. And so really, I think the other thing is it's down to campaign strategists to identify, to locate those issues where issue ownership is clear through surveys, and then trying as much as possible to steer the campaign to be like, no, let's not talk about this stuff. Let's talk about this stuff, which is what I'm strong on. And so when you hear pundits say like, oh, it's great, the debate was a clear success for so-and-so because they're strong on this issue, that might mean that we've got polling that demonstrates that a lot of Americans care a lot about that issue and then also perceive the candidate who's talking about the issue to be quite good or to have a reputation for success on delivering the deliverables on that issue. But, I think this story, like the story that I've just posed, right, where we've got candidates who are, wheeling and dealing and trying as much as possible to stand on this platform of strength and are essentially being successful in many cases in swinging the vote share on the basis of talking about specific issues, as Petrosik would say. This comes up against like a very different story of elections that we saw last time. And I think there's sort of three stylized facts that we saw from that literature that really, I think, makes this comparison quite stark. The first thing is that voters don't know a lot of stuff. And so if they don't know anything about the issues, which again, this is what a lot of surveys have shown over time, a lot of voters are just very bewildered by most issues and don't really know much about either candidate. And that's why they fall back on that heuristic question of how are you today relative to 4 years ago? That's the first thing. The second thing being voters are biased in their judgments of candidates. And so they apply success, even if candidates have not been successful, to the candidates that they are predisposed to like, and interpret the facts differently. We saw that with this idea of motivated reasoning. Like think about like Biscard and his observation that bias finds a way, even in like incontrovertible circumstances, like when during the Great Recession, we saw that the economy was as horrible as it could possibly be. And instead of being like, yeah, this is a terrible economy, I'm going to blame the incumbent, kick the rascals out, a lot of partisans said, hey, even though I recognize that the economy is really bad and the incumbent might play a role, I'm going to twist this judgment around a little bit and blame other people besides the political actors for doing it, essentially. Whereas the people that were motivated to try to kick the rascals out would say, well, actually, it was the politicians who were responsible. So responsibility attributions twisted around in order to sort of serve partisan narratives. And then finally, as we've just talked about, voters don't have ideologies, right? A lot of voters have these scrambled issue positions where they care about one thing or the other, and they don't have a consistent ideological core to their belief systems. They just don't really know or understand what it means to be conservative or liberal, even if they do say that they're conservative or liberal. And so if we compare what Petrosik is saying to this like litany of evidence that voters are just like not really competent to do issue voting, right? We said that issue voting last time, it's really hard, right? It takes knowledge of the incumbent, knowledge of the incumbent's positions on the issue and maybe their past performance. It takes knowledge of the opponent and the opponent's issue positions in order to make an effective ideological judgment. And so maybe in that sense, issue voting is really hard and very rarely practiced. So we got to square these observations, right? Like this doesn't exist. This seems dubious. It seems like maybe something else is happening other than issue score, if that be true. And so I think this leaves us with like a set of really challenging questions. It's a place where essentially two observations hold true, but we've got to sort out which one is more convincing. This is one of the beauties of a voting behavior class, is that the funnel of causality looks great. It's like, oh, here's everything all in this one funnel. We've explained voting. We're done, right? We don't need 15 weeks to figure this out. We'll do issue stuff in the funnel of causality on day one, and we'll walk away from the smoldering ashes of a syllabus on voting. That's not really how this works. Right? Instead, what we have is, even within each sort of piece of the funnel, we've got sort of rivalries of these different explanations and real challenges to understanding the whole. And so the question that I think we're left with, given that we know all this now, is who are these single issue voters? Right? Are they ever really undecided? And I've got a few sort of tentative explanations, or sort of pieces of guesswork maybe about who these single issue voters might be. And again, I want to really challenge you to think hard about this, because this is an active debate in the literature. This is something where we don't know the end-all, be-all story about single-issue voters, and we're still learning about it. So who are these people? Well, they're probably pretty politically sophisticated, right? Because they're people that, again, know enough about a single issue to care deeply about it. We also know that those people, surprise, might actually also exhibit really strong party attachments, because they might be learning over time about which party is catering to their issue. I mean, think about party reputations. These people are sort of like laser focused on parties and their reputations on single issues. And so they care deeply about how parties have performed on their issues over the past. They probably also are engaging to some extent in partisan motivated reasoning, which is actually, I think, an interesting sort of counter argument to the idea that these single issue voters are like really important. And then also they are probably pretty ideologically consistent as well. So I think about, for example, the classic case of the single issue voter is obviously, the issue of abortion is the one that springs to mind traditionally as the example of the single issue voter. We've got this sort of folk story in American politics about this group of people that are like, look, abortion's the one and only thing I care about. And, say that they're pro-life, for example. If a candidate comes out and says they're pro-life, I'll vote for them, even if every single other issue position that they espouse is completely horrible and I can't stand it. Abortion's that important to me, right? Pro-life policies are that important to me that I'll hold my nose, essentially, and vote for any candidate that supports it, right? If you think about it, though, is this a real person, right? Because they're probably very sophisticated. They probably have strong party attachments because they already learned the party's reputation on that issue. They probably have strong partisan motivated reasoning going on, which means that even if that candidate is not actually doing a lot of stuff in the realm of sort of pro-life politics, they're going to like them anyway, right? Because they again, because of party attachments, they've got that motivated reasoning piece. And also, this is a really important thing, people who care so strongly about these single issues are probably learning over time about other people's strong single issues within those parties. And so if we think about, again, the example of that sort of pro-life voter maybe, that person is probably at some point in their political sort of meanderings interacting with somebody who's say a strong pro-Second Amendment kind of person. And so if those people have an interaction, then what ends up happening is the pro-life person starts to try to convince the pro-2A person about pro-life issues. The pro-2A person starts to try to convince the pro-life person about their issue positions. And all of a sudden, lo and behold, because of their interaction, you start to get somebody who is consistent on both of those issues. So both people start to be 2A and pro-life. And so as we go, these highly sophisticated people start to essentially sort their issue positions all into one conservative or liberal orientation. And so it may be that this person obviously still values that single issue above all else. And yet, right, they really, when it comes down to it, are behaving almost completely like any other sort of strongly ideological partisan. I use the pro-life voter as the sort of tried and true example of the single issue voter, but we can think about people on the left as well. I mean, think about somebody I know people like this who are extremely sort of pro-environment. And so environmental issues are at the absolute top of their list in terms of issues. And any candidate that's going to come out in favor of like expanding, anti-pollution efforts or EPA regulations is going to be, a single issue voter for that candidate. And yet, right, we can see that in their ongoing interactions with other people who are in that same tent, that single issue voter is going to start to adopt other issue positions as well on things like, race and social justice, or things like sort of economic programs. And so you're going to start to see that voter also is going to begin to sort all their issue positions in line. And so the question that I'm left with is, A, we don't think that there's probably a lot of single issue voters out there, and B, does it matter? Aren't they just partisans, right? And in that sense, I challenge you to really think hard about that. I'm kind of giving you a little bit of an exaggerated position here, just for the sake of thinking. So don't act like I'm, that's something that I actually believe as a scholar. I want you to really mull this over, right? Are these single issue voters, if they exist, if there are more than just 2 or 3 of them at an IHOP in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, right? If they exist, do they matter? Or are they really just partisans? That, I think, is an important question, and one that I really hope to take up when we get together to talk about this stuff on Wednesday. So have a wonderful week. I really look forward to your reactions to this. I really look forward to your discussion, because, again, this is one of my favorite kinds of political science moments where we've got 2 really strong sets of assumptions from 2 literatures, and they're sort of on a collision course. And the end result is a lot of questions about who's going to win a presidential election. So think about it. I look forward to your reactions, and I will see you all on Wednesday.